They couldn't remember his name for a long time. The conversation itself gradually devolved into an argument, after which any semblance of a festive mood vanished without a trace. The class reunion, the first in over 10 years, had morphed into something strange. Lively chatter was replaced by monosyllabic answers, and instead of communal smoke breaks, there were only quiet retreats from the table. Everyone hid behind their mobile phones. Some feigned receiving a call. Others mindlessly scrolled through feeds, hunched over the table. Once we shared desks, classrooms, and our teacher's attention. We were friends and we quarreled. We hated and we were hated. It happened without intent or purpose, merely as a reaction to the weight of life pressing down upon us, a life from which there was no escape, and which, by necessity, had to be different for every one of us. All of this had been real, but in front of the camera, in that single keepsake photograph that captured us exactly as we had deceived ourselves to be back then, our perceived reality vanished. It yielded to something that had never truly existed. The smiles, the laughter, and the embraces. All of it served to ensure that in our graduation photo, taken just before the plunge into the vast unknown of adulthood, nothing remained but an illusion. This very illusion would, much later, become the monosyllabic answer to all those school years. It was this illusion, it seemed, that most of the assembled classmates held before their eyes as they looked back upon that significant vanished chapter of their lives. In our graduation photo, there were 29 of us. At the table, there were already 18. Already. Perhaps had this meeting happened a year ago, there would have been 19 of us. And had it been 2 years earlier, it is quite likely all 20 would have been there. They tried not to speak of those from our class who had died. Perhaps they were afraid, or perhaps something was finally reaching them too. I kept such thoughts to myself. Throughout all the passing years, I hadn't even voiced them to Steve or Michael. I am certain they too had managed to connect many dots. Beyond the fact that we had been childhood friends, they were also present that evening, in the form of my former classmates. When the main course was served, my former classmates began picking apart those who had left after 9th grade. They recalled their surnames and their ridiculous nicknames. They gossiped about Leah, who had gotten pregnant at graduation, and the guy who dumped her the moment he found out, a month later. They took swipes at Dahlia for moving abroad, focusing even more on her wealthy parents. They touched upon George, who had spiraled into alcoholism a couple of years back. Regarding Tolik, who had bought some success training on Instagram, they simply called him an idiot. But when the conversation turned to his wife, another one of our classmates, Tia, who had gone for lips and forehead work, silence fell. The women envied her, while the men seemed to be remembering something of their own. There were dozens of other names that would mean nothing to you. People who had transferred to other schools, and those who had been expelled. Yuri had sent a group photo from graduation to everyone on Telegram, and for a long time the conversation revolved solely around it. They discussed almost everyone captured in the frame. And then they tried to remember what his name was. Someone said Igor, others said Danny. There were even some completely absurd surnames being tossed out, spoken with a stubborn, misplaced conviction. "What do you mean, Bradman? What Danny? It's Max. Max Postman." Andrew snapped back at her. At the reunion, he had been telling everyone he had a foolproof business idea, but after drinking a bit more than was necessary, he'd let slip that he was investing in crypto. When Steve, Michael, and I shared a knowing smile at his outburst, Andrew began drinking like a man possessed. Staring at Annie's phone, he periodically lunged toward it, trying to grab hold of it just to keep his balance. When Annie showed the photo to Leah, who had walked up to her, Leah instantly declared that it was Alex. But Oliver, glancing at the photo a minute later, said, "How could you not recognize Kirk?" And so they continued to argue, never realizing that every single one of them was wrong. I wonder, had this meeting happened a year earlier, would they have also been unable to remember his name? Perhaps back then, Stanislaw would have been in the frame. Had we met 5 years ago, Arthur, Tessa, and Stella would have been there too. Perhaps if this meeting had happened much sooner, many of them might have remembered him. But as it stood, it seemed only Steve, Michael, and I were the ones who actually knew. A week before Greg was transferred to our class, our homeroom teacher, Mila, gave an entire lecture to our massive classroom. She spoke of how the boy being added to our group suffered from a rare illness, and that under no circumstances were we to fight with him. She pleaded with us to interact with him as calmly as possible, not to startle him or push him, but to treat him with kindness. That same evening, my parents held a much like-minded conversation with me at home. By then, they knew a little more than I did. They also knew that a new family was moving into the house next door. It was from them that I first heard it, that Greg, who would be in my class and living right next to us, had some kind of metal plate inside his head. Greg's parents were either doctors or some kind of pharmaceutical specialists. That was a detail I missed back then, and one I couldn't manage to clarify in the years that followed. I only remember that they were directly involved in the medical field. For that very reason, during the 90s, Greg was able to undergo an experimental brain surgery abroad, after which that same plate became a permanent resident within his skull. Whether he had some kind of congenital disease or a traumatic injury, I don't know. Asking him felt somehow inappropriate. It's like when an acquaintance loses a parent. You simply can't bring yourself to speak of such things. Moreover, there was just a massive swarm of rumors surrounding him, and seeking them out as a source of truth was, for quite obvious reasons, pointless. Greg's first day in our class fell at the end of October. At that time, the poplar tree visible from our classroom window, saturated with autumnal moisture, resembled a homeless man drenched by the rain, one who had arrived seeking light and warmth, which were just inches away on the other side of the thin window pane. It felt like an image from a black and white American film from the 30s. In the backdrop of the Great Depression, someone, somewhere, possessed happiness, but it was only there, behind the glass. Perhaps these blended images merged because I was viewing Greg, who sat directly in front of me through the reflection in the window. During those dark October days, the classroom lights were turned on as early as the first period. In the window's reflection to my left, another classroom would appear, one which usually featured that same lonely poplar tree standing by its own window. Looking at his head through that reflection, I kept trying to catch a glimpse of that plate. In my mind, up until then, both the plate and Greg himself were supposed to look much like the scene from RoboCop, where Alex Murphy first removes his helmet. However, neither Greg nor his head looked anything out of the ordinary. I failed to find any protruding bolts or screws emerging from his skull. It is difficult to judge how appropriate that time was for Greg's transfer to our school. He joined us in the 3rd grade, a period when we still had a single primary school teacher for all our subjects. Perhaps her presence somehow shielded him from the pack of feral hyenas who, during the very first recess, would scream at him, "Show us the plate!" Greg shared a slanted desk with Annie, the same one who, years later, would assert with such certainty that it was Danny Bredman. She was one of those whose name doesn't matter. It was she who would bolt from her seat when the bell rang for recess, begging Mila to move her to another desk. That desire to be moved wouldn't stop her, however, from joining the rest of them in demanding that Greg demonstrate his plate. Greg would just sit there while everyone in the classroom surrounded him, staring at his head. There were stupid jokes and ridiculous comments, snickers and startled cries. There was also anxious whispering and looks full of terror. But the truth was, Greg had a perfectly ordinary head. It had no deep dents or massive scars. Its shape and hair were indistinguishable from anyone else's. Just like everyone else's, it was an ordinary head. For a while, Greg would appear in our class, only to vanish again. At that time, all lessons, much like the days themselves, merged into one another. Even now, in my memory, they are more of a blurred smudge than a distinct period of life. In the courtyard after school, he didn't play with the other children. Instead, he would sit by his house, sometimes with his grandmother, sometimes with his grandfather, even though at that age, almost everyone was allowed to go out and play on their own. One thing I can still recall is his constant, scheduled intake of pills and a small box, much like a Tamagotchi, equipped with a timer. Whenever it began to beep, the entire class would erupt in laughter, at least at first. Later, many began to mimic that melody, attempting to use it as a way to needle the detached Greg. Speaking of him, Greg possessed an uncanny ability to not react to the pranks and taunts of others. He didn't even notice the careless, almost loathsome attitude of those who sat at the same desk as him. When we went to the cafeteria, he reacted with the same detachment to the attention of the older students. Somehow, word had spread through the entire school about his plate, and out of a sense of exotic curiosity, they would come to see the boy with the metal plate in his head. For a time, they tried to give him the nickname Robot, but it never quite stuck, as Greg ignored it entirely. Within our own class, however, many called him simply Plate behind his back, a nickname that eventually clung to him for the rest of his school years. All that time, Greg remained nothing more than another classmate to me. I didn't speak to him, and I was indifferent to him and whatever was happening to him. It is only now that I can roughly imagine what he had to endure back then, though even this likely fails to fully convey his sense of reality. During that first year, the attacks on Greg occurred not just because of his perceived oddity. Those who sat at the same desk as him were irritated by his strange behavior. Greg would sometimes tilt his head sharply to the side, as if listening to something, and then begin covering his ears with his palms. Occasionally, he would jerk his head abruptly, or toss random phrases into the air, or repeat the same words over and over. The teacher would take notice and ask him if he had taken all of his medication. Often, this strange behavior was the result of a missed dose, one of the dozen different pills Greg had to take on a strict schedule. It seemed that while Greg's parents were wealthy enough to arrange homeschooling for him, for some reason, they preferred to subject him to a voluntary hell among the other children. It was only later, once we had actually begun talking, that I learned from Greg that he had been intentionally skipping certain pills. Some made him nauseous, others caused sharp pains in his chest. He carried with him a long plastic case, something resembling a sheath containing the pills organized into many numbered sections. By the way, this communication and our subsequent friendship didn't begin until a year later, in the 5th grade. I don't know what the school system is like now, but after 3rd grade we went straight into 5th, and there were 11 grades in total. Moving into 5th grade meant saying a final goodbye to our primary teacher, and with that we gained complete freedom. That freedom extended to Greg as well. There was no one left to remind him about his medication, and more often, when the timer went off, Greg simply wouldn't take the ones he disliked. It was then, too, that Greg began to become an object of interest for many. For example, he might be sitting there when, in the middle of a lesson, he would suddenly start saying, "Oliver, 2-1, heading to the call." Or first one, I'm 6th, picked up an order for the square. The class would erupt in laughter, while the teachers were driven into a frenzy. Greg convinced everyone that through his plate, he could catch radio waves and taxi driver chatter inside his head. Sometimes, right in the middle of a math exam, he would shout to the entire room, "Scaramouche, Scaramouche, will you do anything?" And everyone would die laughing all over again. The math teacher would demand an explanation, to which Greg would reply that there was nothing he could do. Someone had simply requested a shout-out on the radio. Some teachers would drag him to the principal. Others would make him stand in the corner or force him to leave the room. While reciting a poem in front of the class, Greg might suddenly switch to an advertisement for a car wash, then break into a verse of some catchy pop song, before ending it all with a scream about a local cop who couldn't sleep in his precinct. Greg entertained the whole class, irritated the teachers, and disrupted lessons. In doing so, he became one of the guys. Whenever a lesson was cancelled and we were told to sit quietly, our little group would call Greg over to kill time playing Bloody 5 in a row. Even there, he would drop hilarious lines that had everyone howling. We never even dreamed that he was actually hearing melodies or signals in his head. Everyone, myself included, thought he was just joking around and entertaining others, much like most of us did. The title of class clown carried its own kind of prestige, and when it came to those mid-lesson song outbursts, Greg had no competition whatsoever. After school, we often walked home together since we lived in adjacent houses. As we did, I began to know Greg better, away from his school persona. For instance, I learned that the pills made him feel ill, and that, if it were up to him, he wouldn't take them at all. I learned that his parents worked constantly and would go on business trips for months at a time, which meant he often had to stay with his grandmother and grandfather. I learned that if he skipped his medication, he would begin to pick up radio signals, and sometimes even full television broadcasts. Signals so vivid that he saw them instead of what was actually happening before his eyes. He always seemed to want to tell me something else, but every time we would reach our houses and say our goodbyes. I think he wanted to tell me something he had no one else to talk to about, something that truly terrified him. Around that same time, Greg began coming to my courtyard after school to hang out with our group, which included Steve and Michael. They were the very same people who, at the class reunion, would sit in silence when others tried to remember what that guy's name was in the photo. Even there, he didn't abandon his antics, frequently shouting out fragments of songs or radio advertisements. For many of us, 2004 was a time when we were just hearing about the Game Boy for the first time, but Greg already had a Game Boy Advance SP, which he always brought along when he came to hang out in our courtyard. A year later, when we were in 6th grade, Greg was already being allowed to go to computer clubs with us, and just one more year after that, he began inviting us over to his house. He had a massive plasma TV, the size of a window, a DVD stereo system, a PS2, and an Xbox 360 brought from the States. He had a computer that ran every game imaginable and high-speed internet. The consoles and the PC were somewhat dusty, as if Greg hadn't touched them in months. The only thing that clearly caught the eye and looked alive against that general backdrop of decay was his desk. There were dozens of stacks of A4 paper. Mountains of albums and notebooks rose up like entire towers made of thick reams of paper. At home, Greg drew without pause. It seemed he truly loved it. His drawings were mostly abstract, or else nothing but solid blackness. The first time we were at his house, I couldn't initially discern anything concrete in them, but Greg eventually explained everything to me. It is impossible to say for certain now whether I was actually frightened then, or if the terror I am destined to experience years from now will simply distort those memories. Perhaps I did experience some kind of deep unconscious horror, and perhaps it was because even then, that horror had already happened. It just hadn't occurred in that timeline yet, and I was merely hearing the echoes of its future resonance. What Greg did initially seemed harmless, and his explanation sounded like pure nonsense, no different from his stories about the radio in his head. However, much of his physical appearance, the distorted facial features, the tense brows, the hollow cheekbones, and the rolling eyes even at that age, signaled that something was wrong. And the way he drew actually silenced Steve and Michael, who had been absorbed in playing their second PlayStation. Greg held his pencil the way one usually holds a skinning knife. Leaning over the sheet of A4, he began moving his hand from side to side with incredible speed. It looked as though he were simply shading it in entirely. Only for a fraction of a second would he pause, as if he were printing an image rather than drawing it. Those rapid, sharp, and unnatural movements made everyone in the room tense up. The boys called his name, but Greg was as if in a trance, continuing to draw until he finally finished. Even with the lights on, under the desk lamp, and from every possible angle, I still couldn't understand what he had drawn. There were hundreds of such identical drawings. I see it. I see it constantly, as soon as I close my eyes, Greg said, continuing to stare at the drawing along with us. There was nothing substantial in his imagery, other than varying degrees of blackness. So, if he truly saw something, his drawings failed to trigger any personal associations in me. From that day, standing in Greg's room, staring at his sketches, to the incredible year of 2007, there were about 6 months left. Despite all the prohibitions and the risks to his life, during the summer of 2007, he would smoke his first cigarette. Like all of us, he would try to mask the stench of smoke in his mouth with candy. With our last bit of money, we would buy a 2-liter bottle of cold Coke and drink it in turns. Along with the cigarettes, he would vomit, and we would spend the rest of the day sitting in a gazebo. Playing cards would be scattered across the table, and the empty 2-liter Coke bottle would have begun to bloat from the heat. For the first time in many years, aside from those pills that made him feel ill, his body would also be deprived of the ones he desperately needed to survive. They wouldn't have time to dissolve in his stomach. They would end up somewhere among the bushes along with the vomit. In the evening, when we all went our separate ways, he would sit at his desk again and begin to draw. And then, instead of indecipherable black blots, for the first time in years, clear images would emerge. The next day, he would bring the drawing out to show us. Everyone, including me, would tell him, "It's just bushes, with a path leading through them," and Greg would continue to see it. He would continue to draw it over and over, but the quality of his work would once again degrade into smeared blots of blackness, and that path through the thickets would be lost in barely perceptible shifts of color. It was then that Greg made the conscious decision to stop taking his prescribed medication. He wouldn't tell us, his friends, about this until later, about a week after he had first refused them. There was no one left to monitor him. His parents were gone on business trips abroad for months at a time, and his grandmother and grandfather were naturally aging, only remembering to call his phone as evening approached. Greg had stopped carrying that cheerful beeping timer the year before. The same year he eventually stopped bringing the pill sheath along with him. Did this pass without leaving a trace on his physical health? Perhaps. We could only judge that, perhaps, by his outward appearance. His limbs were intact. He didn't faint, his nose didn't bleed, and his hands didn't shake. And Greg himself always reassured us whenever the subject of his medication came up. Though we were naive, we did discuss his refusal with him back then. I don't think any of us fully grasped the potential consequences. It seems to me we were simply afraid in our hearts that he might die while out walking with us. Perhaps that is why, even when Greg wasn't around, we never touched upon the topic, as if the mere act of discussing it could somehow affect him. Greg, for his part, reassured us in a very convincing manner. He told us that most of the pills he was required to take were just vitamins, that he continued to take all the vital medications like his vasodilators, but that he simply did so once a day at home, and we didn't press him much, choosing instead to take his word for it. As time went on, the quality of Greg's drawings began to improve. Yes, quality. It sounds strange at first glance, but the drawings themselves remained essentially the same. It was as if the images upon them were simply becoming sharper. These transformations once again reminded me of printed images. While that is common and ubiquitous now, back then, printing school reports was only just beginning to emerge. And with it, the printer was transitioning from a luxury item to a vital academic necessity. Even in my house, one had appeared by that time. I only actually used mine to print reports a handful of times. Instead, as long as there was ink, I spent my time printing out homemade posters. I would find photos of my favorite rock bands on album covers, download them, and print them out. Very often, those printed photos would come out completely blurred. The lines would lose their definition and, much like Greg's drawings, would dissolve into varying shades of blackness, even though the image on the computer screen remained perfectly clear. It seemed to me that something similar was happening with Greg. It was as if the pills he had been taking regularly were somehow degrading the quality of the image in his head. The moment he stopped taking them, each subsequent image he produced gained new details. Beyond the thick bushes, trees began to appear, and soon after, I could discern massive pillars behind them. Along with these emerging details, the image itself was not static. It was as if Greg were assembling a picture. In other words, he was moving toward it. By closer to July, he already had dozens of different images. Greg would scan them and upload them to his computer. When he scrolled through them using the mouse wheel, we would watch a short film, a kind of slideshow. The camera moved through bushes and trees, and just looking at those places, wondering where it might all lead, left me feeling strangely unsettled. A significant part of this was due to Greg's habit of drawing exclusively with a plain graphite pencil. It gave everything an ominous tint, including the distant sun that would flicker briefly in the frame. By then, Greg had compiled an entire short film on his computer from his scanned drawings. He showed it to me more than once, and with every new frame added, the experience of watching his little movie made me increasingly anxious. It will be difficult for you to imagine, but I will try to explain. Imagine something completely abstract, blurred, and filthy before your eyes. In the next frame, the image becomes clearer, giving you a vague idea of what is actually happening on the screen. Then, the image becomes even more detailed and high quality, and specific forms replace mere associations. Bushes, trees, branches, leaves, a path, stones, and pillars. And then, like in a silent film, this entire exposition begins to move, as if leading you towards something. For some reason, that movement filled me with dread. The journey itself never ended with anything concrete. The images simply began to repeat, because Greg was switching them manually, spinning the mouse wheel with his finger. And it was when his mini-movie repeated several times in a row that something strange happened to me. I began to feel as though I had seen those bushes, those trees, and that path somewhere before, as if it had already happened, or at least as if I had dreamed it. But it felt like it had happened a very long time ago, so long ago that one could be speaking of a past life. It became even more terrifying to think that these flashes of recognition weren't even mine, and that someone else was remembering them too. Someone sitting somewhere far away, not here. I didn't say anything to Greg then. I just waited until he grew tired of it. That was how our summer routine passed, until a few weeks before the end of vacation, when I suggested to Greg that we go to the city waterworks to take a swim. Greg agreed. That was when it all began.